The wind off the Kansas prairie could steal a man's hat, his dignity, and apparently someone else's entire future, all in the same gust. Patrick Collier had been riding the open stretch of land between Dodge City and the little settlement of Millhaven for the better part of the morning, when the paper came at him like a living thing, snapping and twisting against the blue September sky of 1878 before it plastered itself flat against the chest of his buckskin mare, Clover. He caught it by instinct, pinching it between two fingers before the wind could take it again, and he almost crumpled it without a second thought. He was a practical man by nature, a cattle hand who had spent the last 6 years working drives up from Texas, and stray paper on the prairie usually meant nothing more than a discarded bill of sale or a torn page from some almanac. But something made him smooth it against his saddle horn and look. It was a map, hand-drawn with careful, deliberate lines in dark ink, the kind of ink that had been applied by someone who knew what they were doing. It showed a section of land he recognized immediately, the flat stretch east of Millhaven where the creek bent south before straightening again, and there were notations written in a neat, feminine script all along the margins. Homestead claim, boundary markers, the distance from the creek to the proposed site of a well. There were small drawings of a house, a barn, a kitchen garden, all sketched with that same careful hand. Arrows pointed to compass directions. There was a notation that read, "Good soil, dark loam, tested September 3, 1878. Patrick lifted his hat and scratched the back of his head, looking out across the prairie in the direction the wind had come from. It had come from the southeast, from the direction of that very creek bend the map showed. Somebody had lost this map, and not somebody passing through. This was a map that mattered to someone. It had the feel of a plan, of a dream put down on paper, and that meant somewhere behind him, someone was missing it. He told himself he was foolish for turning Clover around. He had a job waiting in Millhaven, a meeting with a cattle buyer who didn't appreciate lateness, and the wind was picking up again with that late summer edge that promised a hard afternoon. He told himself all of this and turned Clover around anyway, tucking the map carefully inside his vest against his shirt, so the wind couldn't take it a second time. The prairie stretched out in every direction, gold and brown with the late season, the grass bending in long uniform waves that made the land look like it was breathing. Patrick rode easy, letting Clover set her own pace, his eyes moving across the distance in that practiced way a man developed after years of watching open country. He was looking for movement, for color that didn't belong, and he found it about a mile back the way he had come from, a figure standing at the edge of the creek, very still, looking at the ground and then at the sky, turning in a slow circle the way a person does when they have lost something and cannot understand how. He rode toward her at a steady walk, not rushing, because a lone woman on the open prairie in 1878 had every right to be startled by a rider coming at her hard, and he was not a man who frightened people if he could help it. As he drew closer, she came into focus, and she was not at all what he expected, though he could not have said afterward what exactly he had expected. Dorothy Boone was 24 years old, tall and straight-backed in a way that suggested she had not learned her posture from a finishing school, but from a life that required keeping your spine upright when everything around you was trying to push you down. She wore a dark blue dress that was practical and clean, not fancy, and her brown hair was pinned up under a bonnet she had pushed back off her head, so it hung by its ribbons around her neck. Her face was fine-boned and sun-browned, with eyes that were a particular shade of green that caught the light like creek water in the morning. Those eyes were currently scanning the prairie with an expression of barely controlled panic that she was working very hard to keep off her face. She heard Clover's hooves and turned sharply, one hand going to her side where, Patrick noted with something between admiration and caution, there was a small revolver in a plain leather holster. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said, because those were always the right first words out here. He raised one hand to show it was empty and kept Clover moving at that same easy walk. "My name's Patrick Collier. I'm a hand out of the Breckenridge outfit, just passing through on my way to Millhaven." She watched him with those green eyes and kept her hand where it was. "Dorothy Boone," she said after a moment, and her voice was steadier than her eyes, with a faint accent that made him think Tennessee or maybe Kentucky. "What brings you riding back this direction, Mr. Collier? Millhaven is west." "I know it is," he said. He stopped Clover about 20 feet from her, which was the respectful distance, and he reached into his vest and pulled out the folded map and held it up. "The wind brought me something about a mile back that way. I thought maybe somebody out here was missing it." The change that came over Dorothy Boone's face was something Patrick would think about for a long time afterward. The careful composure cracked open all at once, and something raw and relieved, and almost tearful, swept through her expression before she got control of it again. She crossed the distance between them in a few quick strides and took the map from his hand with both of hers, pressing it flat, checking the ink, checking the edges. "Thank God," she said very quietly, and it wasn't directed at him. It was just a private thing that came out because it had to. Then she looked up at him and said more formally, "Thank you, Mr. Collier. I have been searching for the better part of an hour. I thought it was gone for good." "Important map," he said. "The most important map I own," she said. "It's my homestead claim. I drew it from the survey records in Dodge City last week. I've been walking the boundaries today to make sure I understand the land before I start building." She paused and then seemed to decide he had earned at least a small explanation. "I filed my claim 3 days ago. 160 acres under the Homestead Act. This is mine now, if I can prove it up." Patrick looked at the land around them with fresh eyes. He had ridden through this stretch dozens of times and had always thought it was good land, better than most, with that creek for water and the dark soil that grew grass thick enough to cut and bale. "That's a fine piece of ground," he said, and he meant it. "You're doing this alone." He didn't mean it as a challenge, and something in his tone must have communicated that, because she didn't receive it as one. She lifted her chin slightly and said, "I am. My father passed last spring and left me with enough money for the filing fee and the lumber I'll need for a small house and the train fare out from Nashville. I've got a wagon and 2 mules at the settlement about 3 miles north, and a neighbor woman there, Mrs. Hale, who has agreed to let me stay in her spare room until I get the house up." She folded the map carefully and tucked it into the small leather satchel she carried over one shoulder. "So yes, alone. Is that a problem?" "Not at all," Patrick said. "I was just thinking you could use an extra set of hands." She looked at him squarely, and he got the full force of those green eyes at close range and felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with his physical heart and everything to do with it at the same time. "I don't know you, Mr. Collier," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I know this land and I know how to build, and I've got a week before my next job starts. I've been planning to spend it in Millhaven doing nothing in particular." He shrugged, and it was the kind of shrug a man does when he is trying to make something sound casual that is not quite as casual as he is presenting it. "Seems like a waste when there's honest work to be done." Dorothy studied him for a long moment. He sat easy on Clover with his hands crossed on the saddle horn, a lean man of 28 with a sun-darkened face and brown eyes that were direct without being aggressive, dressed in plain working clothes with the kind of calluses on his hands that you could see even from where she was standing. She was a practical woman, and she had learned to read people quickly, because a woman making her way alone in 1878 could not afford to read them wrong. "3 conditions," she said at last. "Name them." "You work for wages because I won't be beholden to anyone's charity. I pay fair, not generous, because I have limited funds. You stay in the settlement, not on my land, until the house is built and I have moved in. And if I tell you to leave, you leave without argument." "Agreed to all 3, Patrick said without hesitation. And just like that, without quite understanding how it happened, Patrick Collier's week of doing nothing in particular transformed into something else entirely. Mrs. Hale turned out to be a stout, weathered woman of about 50 who had come west with her husband 12 years ago, and buried him 4 years back, and had seen too much to be surprised by much of anything. She took one look at Patrick when Dorothy brought him to the settlement that evening, assessed him with the thoroughness of a woman who had survived a long time on the frontier, and told him he could sleep in the barn for $1 a week and meals were at 6 in the morning and 7 in the evening, and she didn't serve lunch because she wasn't running a hotel. Patrick paid her 2 weeks in advance and thanked her, and Mrs. Hale said he was either very hopeful or very foolish, and Dorothy, standing in the doorway of the small log cabin, laughed. It was the first time Patrick heard her laugh, and it was not a small sound, not a polite feminine offering. It was a real laugh, quick and bright, and it transformed her face in a way that made Patrick stand very still for a moment, the way a man does when he sees something beautiful that he doesn't have a word for yet. He was sensible enough to say nothing about that. They started the next morning, the 4th of September, with the dawn. Dorothy had already arranged for the lumber to be delivered from the mill in Millhaven, and she had a plan drawn out, compact and practical, a single-story house of 4 rooms with a porch along the front, positioned on a slight rise about a quarter-mile from the creek so it would stay dry in a hard rain. Patrick looked at the plan and saw that she had thought about everything in the right order: the well site, the drainage, the direction the prevailing wind came from in winter. "You planned this carefully," he said, crouching over the paper she had spread on the wagon seat. "I've been planning it for 2 years," she said, "since I first read about the Homestead Act. My father thought it was a foolish idea for a woman alone, and for a long time I thought he might be right. And then he got sick, and while I was nursing him and waiting to find out if there was going to be anything left after the doctor's bills, I went back to the plan, because it was the one thing that was mine." She said this matter-of-factly, without self-pity, and then straightened and picked up the plan. "The lumber arrives this afternoon. We can stake the foundation today." She was efficient and she knew the work, not because she had built before, but because she had studied it with the same careful attention she had given to the map, and she had a good eye for level ground and straight lines. Patrick was quick and strong, and he had spent enough time on ranches to know every practical thing about construction and maintenance. They were a good team, which neither of them mentioned aloud because saying it would have made it strange. By the end of that first day, they had the foundation staked, the perimeter marked with string lines, and the first delivery of lumber stacked and covered against the possibility of rain. They were both tired and dirty, and Dorothy had a blister on her right palm from the mallet, and Patrick had a bruised thumb from a nail that had moved on him, and they walked back to the settlement in the amber evening light in companionable silence that felt, to Patrick's mild astonishment, completely natural. Mrs. Hale fed them salt pork and beans and corn bread, and watched the two of them without appearing to watch them at all, the way experienced women watch things they find interesting. Over the next several days, the house began to take shape. The wall frames went up on the 3rd day, and Dorothy stood back from the first completed frame and looked at it for a long time without saying anything, and Patrick, watching her from the other side of it, understood that she was seeing not just the wood but the thing the wood represented, the solidity of it, the permanence. "It's real," she said very quietly. "More real every day," he said. She looked at him then over the frame, and there was something unguarded in her expression for a moment, something open and wondering, before she reached for her hammer and went back to work. Patrick went back to work too, and they did not mention the moment, but it settled somewhere in the air between them like a thing that had been named without words. He began to learn her in the way you learn a person when you work alongside them every day. He learned that she sang to herself very softly when she was concentrating on a difficult task, old hymns and folk songs she had brought from Tennessee in her memory. He learned that she kept a small journal in her satchel and wrote in it every evening by whatever light was available, and that she never apologized for this habit, just did it without explanation. He learned that she had strong opinions about the right way to do things, and would tell him so directly and without cruelty if she thought he was doing something wrong, and that she was almost always right. He learned that she had taught school for 2 years in Nashville before her father's illness, and that she could do arithmetic in her head faster than he could on paper. He learned that she had a brother somewhere in California she had not seen in 4 years, a complicated separation that she mentioned once and did not elaborate on. He learned that she was braver than she let on because he caught her once in the early morning, standing alone in the middle of her land, with both hands pressed flat against the earth and her eyes closed. And when she heard him coming and opened her eyes and looked up at him, there was a flicker of something that might have been fear, not of him, but of the sheer size of what she was doing, before it was replaced by that straight-backed composure. "I just like to remind myself it's solid," she said, as if that explained everything. "It does that," he said. "It holds you up even when you're not paying attention." She rose and brushed the soil off her hands and looked at him with those creekwater eyes, and there was a question in them she didn't ask. Patrick didn't answer it either because he wasn't ready, but he felt it between them like a warm current. On the 6th day, they had the walls up and were ready to begin the roof, and Patrick's week was technically over. He didn't mention it, and Dorothy didn't mention it, and in the morning he went to his work on the house, and she came out to meet him, and that was all either of them needed to say about it. It was during the roof work on the 7th day that they ran into trouble. They were not alone in this corner of Kansas. The territory was full of competing interests, homesteaders and ranchers, and the ranchers had been there longer and did not always welcome the fences that homesteaders eventually put up across land that cattle had been ranging over freely for years. There was a man named Gideon Haas who ran cattle on the eastern range of Millhaven County, and whose particular brand of displeasure with the Homestead Act was well known in every saloon from Millhaven to Dodge City. Patrick was up on the roof frame when he heard the horses, and he straightened and counted 3 riders coming at a deliberate pace across the grass from the south. Dorothy was below him, measuring boards, and he said quietly, "Company coming," and she looked up and then stood up and waited. Gideon Haas was a large man in his 40s with the permanent squint of someone who spent their life in the sun, and whose entire manner communicated the irritation of a person accustomed to getting what they wanted. He pulled his horse up 20 feet from the house and looked at the structure with undisguised contempt. "Dorothy Boone," he said, not pleasantly. "Mr. Haas," Dorothy said. Her voice was perfectly level. "Word is you filed on this section," Haas said. "I want you to know I've been ranging cattle across this creek bend for 11 years. I've got grazing arrangements with the territory that predate your little piece of paper." "Grazing arrangements are not the same as title," Dorothy said. "I have a legal homestead claim filed with the land office in Dodge City. The land is public land, and I have every legal right to it under the Homestead Act of 1862. Haas looked at Patrick on the roof with the specific unfriendliness of a man who is adjusting his threat based on the audience. "Who's this?" "A hired hand," Dorothy said. "You'd be smart to take your hired hand and go back where you came from," Haas said. "Land out here is hard on people who don't know it." "I know it well enough," Dorothy said. She had not moved and her hand was not on her revolver, but she was not pretending it wasn't there either. "I'm just being neighborly," Haas said, in a tone that was not at all neighborly. "This particular stretch of land is inconvenient for my operation." "Then your operation will need to adjust," Dorothy said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Haas." There was a long pause in which Haas considered his options, and Patrick came down from the roof frame with deliberate unhurry and stood beside Dorothy. It was not a threatening gesture, just a statement of alignment, but it changed the geometry of the situation, and Haas read it clearly. "We'll see how long you last out here," Haas said, and turned his horse and rode back south with his men. Dorothy let out a slow breath when they were gone. Patrick watched the riders until they were small with distance. "He's going to be a problem," Patrick said. "I know it," Dorothy said. She folded her arms across her chest and looked at the ground for a moment, thinking. "He can't do anything legal. The claim is proper and filed." "Doesn't have to be legal to be trouble," Patrick said. "No," she agreed. It doesn't. She was quiet for another moment, and then she lifted her head and looked at the half-built house with her jaw set. "I'm not leaving," she said. "Not to Patrick, not really. Just to the air, to Haas's retreating back to the prairie itself. A statement of pure fact." "I didn't think you were," Patrick said. She looked at him sideways, and there was something warm that moved through her expression and was quickly managed. "You didn't have to come down off the roof," she said. "I know," he said. He went back up the roof and they went back to work. And neither of them said anything more about Haas or about Patrick coming down off the roof. But something had shifted again in the careful space between them, had moved a half step closer, and both of them felt it, and neither was quite sure what to do with it yet. That evening, walking back to the settlement, Dorothy said without preamble, "Why are you still here, Mr. Collier?" Patrick considered the question seriously because she had asked it seriously. "I've been asking myself that," he said. "I think the honest answer is that I'm not ready to not be here yet." She looked at him for a moment and then looked ahead at the trail. "That's a complicated way of putting a simple thing," she said. "I know," he said. "I appreciate the honesty," she said. Then, after a pause, "I'm not opposed to you staying, if you want to be honest about that as well." "I'll be honest about that," he said. Mrs. Hale watched them come in that evening with something approaching satisfaction in her eyes, and said nothing at all, which was the most eloquent thing she could have done. The house was finished on the 14th day. It stood solid and straight on its little rise above the creek bend, painted white with blue trim because Dorothy had found half a can of blue paint at the hardware store in Millhaven and had decided that a house deserved to have color. It had 4 rooms, a porch along the front as planned, a stone hearth that Patrick had spent 2 days laying, and windows that faced south and east to catch the morning light and the afternoon warmth. When the last board was nailed and the last window frame was set, Dorothy walked through every room alone, slowly, with her hand trailing along the walls, and Patrick sat on the porch steps and waited and watched the prairie and did not disturb her. After a while she came out and stood on the porch and looked at the view, the long sweep of golden grass to the horizon, the ribbon of the creek catching the late afternoon sun, and Patrick looked up at her from the steps, and she was crying, very quietly, in the specific way that people cry when they are not sad at all, but the feeling is too large for any other expression. He did not say anything foolish. He just sat there and let her have it, and after a while she wiped her face with the back of her wrist and said, 16 years from now I'll own this land outright. That's what 5 years of proving up gets me, and then the title is mine forever." 16 years from now, Patrick said carefully. "Where do you see yourself standing when you say that?" She looked down at him and something between them went very still. "Right here," she said. Then she added, in a voice that was just slightly quieter than her normal voice, "Where do you see yourself?" He stood up because the conversation seemed to require him to be standing, and he turned to face her on the porch steps, which put their eyes at nearly the same level. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "I've been thinking about it since about the 3rd day, actually, but I didn't want to say anything until the house was done because I didn't want you to think I was saying it because of the work." "Saying what?" she asked, though the look in her eyes suggested she knew. "That I don't want to ride to Millhaven and take another cattle job," he said. "That I'd rather stay on this claim and help you work it properly, not as a hired hand this time. That I've spent 14 days thinking about you and your map and your plan and your straight back and the way you sing to yourself when you're concentrating, and I'd like to spend a good deal more time than 14 days doing the same." He paused. "I know that's a lot to put on a person who met me as a stranger 2 weeks ago." Dorothy was quiet for what felt to Patrick like a very long time, but was probably only a few seconds. Then she said, "Mr. Collier, Patrick, I am a practical woman who makes decisions on the basis of evidence. And the evidence of the last 2 weeks is that you are hardworking and honest and kind, and you don't make me feel like I need to apologize for knowing what I want." She tilted her head slightly. "That is not common in my experience." "No," he said. "I don't suppose it is." "So I think," she said, That you should come inside and have some of Mrs. Hale's pie that I brought in the basket, and we should talk about what staying on this claim would look like practically, because I'm not a woman who skips to the end without the middle. I wouldn't want you to be, he said. She almost smiled, which from Dorothy Boone was the equivalent of a full grin from anyone else, and she held the door open for him, and they went inside and sat at the small table that was the only furniture in the kitchen and ate pie, and talked until the sky outside went from orange to purple to the dense blue-black of a clear plains night. And by the time they talked themselves out, they had covered cattle and crops and money and the future, and the past in a way that left Patrick understanding more about Dorothy Boone than he had understood about any person in his life. He walked back to the settlement alone in the dark, because propriety still mattered and Dorothy had made that clear pleasantly but firmly, and Mrs. Hale was sitting on her porch in the dark smoking a pipe and said without turning her head, "How'd it go?" "We talked," Patrick said. "Good," Mrs. Hale said. "Talking is how things start." The weeks that followed had a quality that Patrick would later describe, when he was much older and someone asked him when he knew, as the quality of something real beginning. He had a life before those weeks, years of cattle drives and campfires and towns he had never intended to stay in, but it was the kind of life that was wide and thin, all surface and no depth, and these weeks had depth to them in a way he had not experienced before. He moved into the linta he built against the south side of the barn on Dorothy's claim, which was proper and above reproach, and every morning they worked the land together, breaking sod in the garden plot she had planned, digging the well with the help of a well-digger named Abel Marsh from Millhaven who had forearms like a blacksmith and charged fair prices, and did not ask unnecessary questions. They planted a kitchen garden that was too late in the season to do much more than get established, but Dorothy said that was all right. She was planting for next year. She introduced herself to her neighbors one by one, riding out with Patrick to the surrounding claims and settlements, and she was received with varying degrees of welcome from warm to cautious, but she was thorough and genuine, and people came around to her in the end. There was a young couple named Will and Sarah Hendricks on the claim to the north, who had arrived 3 months before Dorothy, and who became friends quickly, sharing tools and knowledge and Sunday dinners that rotated between the two properties. Gideon Haas stayed away for several weeks, and Patrick thought about him often with the specific attention a man pays to a problem he knows isn't solved, just postponed. He mentioned it to Dorothy. "He hasn't done anything," Dorothy said. "Not yet," Patrick said. "I've written to the land office in Dodge City confirming my claim," Dorothy said, "and to the county sheriff informing him of our interaction. I like to have things on record." Patrick looked at her and shook his head slowly in what had become, he realized, a habitual expression of admiring exasperation. "You wrote to the sheriff before anything happened." "Prevention is easier than cure," she said, not looking up from the field she was measuring. "My father was a lawyer, Patrick. I grew up understanding that paper is more powerful than a gun in the long term. And in the short term," she glanced at him sideways, "that's what the revolver is for." He laughed, and she allowed herself a real smile, and the sound of the two of them together moved out across the quiet prairie and was lost in the enormous sky. It was during the 3rd week of October, with the air turning sharp and the first real cold coming down from the north, that the trouble with Haas arrived in a different form than Patrick had expected. He came home from Millhaven one afternoon, where he had gone to collect supplies and pick up Dorothy's mail, to find that someone had opened the gate of the small corral where Dorothy's 2 mules were kept, and both mules were gone. The gate latch was not broken. It had been deliberately opened. Dorothy stood at the empty corral with her hands on the top rail, and her face very still in the way it went when she was controlling something strong. "Those mules are my primary means of working this claim," she said. Her voice was flat and careful. "I know it," Patrick said. "Without them I cannot break sod, I cannot haul, I cannot make this claim productive." "I'll go after them," he said. They won't have gone far. Mules don't like the open prairie at night. It's not about the mules, Dorothy said. She turned to look at him. It's about what this means. Someone came onto my property and opened that gate deliberately, and we both know who. Yes, Patrick said. I cannot prove it. No, not yet. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Find the mules, Patrick, please. And then tomorrow I'm going to Dodge City." He found the mules 3 miles south, grazing contentedly in a low hollow beside a stand of cottonwoods, exactly the direction cattle came from on the Haas Range. He brought them back and stabled them, and reinforced the corral gate with a proper padlock he'd brought from Millhaven. And in the morning, Dorothy rode to Dodge City with a list of written grievances and the determination of a woman who had not come 1,200 miles to be pushed off her land by a man who thought his convenience outweighed the law. She was gone 2 days, and Patrick kept the claim going in her absence, doing the work of 2 people without complaint. And on the evening of the second day, he sat on the porch of her house and watched the sunset paint the prairie in shades of red and amber, and thought about how the land looked different to him now than it had a month ago. He had spent his whole adult life moving across the West and had never once thought of a particular piece of it as his. The very concept had been foreign to him, not because he was incapable of wanting it, but because there had never been anything that made wanting it feel real and specific. This land felt real and specific. He could feel the corners of it in his chest. Dorothy came back on the third day with a written notice from the Dodge City Land Office and a statement from the county sheriff that had been sent on to Haas's property, and a document from the territorial governor's office that she had somehow managed to procure through a contact she had made during her 2 days in the city, acknowledging the legality of her claim and noting that any interference with a legally established homestead was a matter for federal jurisdiction. "How did you get a document from the governor's office?" Patrick asked, reading it with honest disbelief. "My father's law partner from Nashville has a cousin who was appointed to the territorial government 2 years ago," Dorothy said, unpacking her saddlebags with brisk efficiency. "I wrote to him when I first filed the claim, just in case. He came through." Patrick stared at her. "You have been 3 steps ahead of all of this from the beginning," he said slowly. "I've had 2 years to think about every possible problem," she said, "and I have spent those 2 years thinking." She looked up at him, and there was a glint in those green eyes that was something between humor and steel. "I'm not naive, Patrick. I know what the world thinks about a woman homesteading alone. I prepared accordingly." He handed the document back to her, and he did something he had not done before. He reached out and took her hand, the one that was reaching to take the document back, and held it. Just that, just her hand in his, standing in the kitchen of her new house on her new land, and he said, "I know you don't need me here. I want you to know I know that." She looked at their hands and then at his face. "I know you know it," she said. "That's part of why I want you here." The first frost came at the end of October, and with it, a new kind of day on the claim, less building and more preparation, laying in wood for the winter, banking the foundation of the house against the cold, preserving the last of the kitchen garden produce. The prairie turned from gold to brown to the dull silver of late autumn, and the sky was enormous and gray and full of moving cloud, and the cold came in with a particular honesty that the West had about its seasons, no half measures, no soft transitions. Patrick had been sleeping in the Linta for 2 months and had made it tolerably comfortable, but the first real freeze of November made the question of arrangements press itself more urgently. He did not raise it, because it was Dorothy's claim and Dorothy's home, and he would not presume. But one morning she came out to find him cutting firewood in the gray early light with his breath making clouds in the cold air, and she stood in the doorway of the house for a moment and then said, "You could build yourself a proper room inside." He looked up. "Just from a practical standpoint?" he asked. "From a practical standpoint," she said, and then she almost smiled, "among other standpoints." He built the room. It took 4 days, because he had gotten skilled at this particular house, and it occupied a corner of the main room that could be partitioned properly, and Mrs. Hale came out to inspect it and pronounced it acceptable and properly arranged, and then sat down to dinner with them and told them both, in her forthright way, that she had been watching them for 2 months, and that they were both being very careful and very slow, and that there was nothing wrong with that. But she wanted it on the record that life was shorter than you planned for, and the frontier was harder than you anticipated, and she had watched enough people wait too long for things. "I'm just saying, Mrs. Hale said, eating her beans, that a person knows when something is right." Dorothy looked at her plate and then at Patrick and then back at her plate. Patrick said, "Mrs. Hale, would you do us the honor of having dinner with us again on Sunday?" "I'll bring pie," Mrs. Hale said comfortably. On the Sunday in question, the first Sunday of December of 1878, Patrick waited until after dinner, when Mrs. Hale had very diplomatically excused herself to walk back to her wagon, and then he stood up from the table and Dorothy stood up on the other side of it, and the two of them looked at each other across the cleared plates in the lamplight of the kitchen of the house they had built together. "Dorothy," he said, and then he stopped and tried again. "I'm not a man who has a great deal of eloquence. I want to say something to you that the words need to be right for, and I'm not sure I have the right words." "Try anyway," she said quietly. "I came out here for 6 years with nothing in particular pointing me any direction," he said. "I was a hand, a good one, and I worked the drives and I moved with the cattle and I ate dust and slept under the sky, and I thought that was what my life was, because I hadn't found anything that made me want to stop moving." He paused. "A piece of paper blew into my hands on the prairie and I turned around to bring it back, and I found you standing at the edge of a creek looking for it, and everything in me just stopped moving, not in a frightened way, in the way a compass stops when it finds north." Dorothy was very still. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because you need a husband, or because this claim needs a man, or because of any practical consideration of that kind, because you have made it perfectly clear that you don't need those things. I'm asking because I want to spend my life building what you're building, not helping you build it but building it with you, as your equal and your partner and your husband." He came around the table because the table between them seemed wrong now, and he stood in front of her with his hands at his sides and said, "If you'll have me." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment and her eyes were bright in the lamplight, and she said, "Patrick Collier, I knew 3 days after you turned around on that prairie that you were going to ask me that question. I have been deciding ever since whether to say yes." "And," he said, "and," she said, "I have decided." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the way a person touches something they have been thinking about touching for a long time, and said, "Yes." He kissed her then, there in the lamplight of the kitchen of the house they had built together, and it was a long and careful and very certain kiss, the kind that knows exactly what it is. They were married on the 14th of December, 1878, in the small church that the settlement of Millhaven had raised that spring, by a traveling preacher named Reverend Caldwell, who came through twice a year, and who had a warm voice and a genuine feeling for the ceremony. Mrs. Hale stood up for Dorothy, and Will Hendricks stood up for Patrick, and Sarah Hendricks cried happy tears and then apologized for it, and then cried some more. The church was cold and had no stove yet, so everyone kept their coats on, and someone had brought field flowers dried from the summer that were brown and gold and beautiful in their way, and Dorothy wore her best dress, a deep green that matched her eyes, and Patrick wore the best shirt he owned, which Mrs. Hale had quietly mended and pressed without being asked. When Reverend Caldwell asked if anyone had any objections, and the church was silent for a moment, Will Hendricks coughed once nervously and Sarah laughed, and then they all laughed and the Reverend smiled and continued. And Patrick and Dorothy looked at each other, and in that look was the distilled feeling of every morning they had worked side by side, and every evening they had walked back in the amber light, and every word they had said across the table and under the sky, and in the silence between them that was as full as any sentence. "I do," Dorothy said, and her voice carried in the cold, still air of the church. "I do," Patrick said, and he meant it with everything he had. Gideon Haas made one more attempt in the spring, not a violent one but a legal one, filing a counterclaim on a technicality of the boundary survey that his lawyer had found or possibly manufactured. It went to the land office in Dodge City, and from there to the federal court in Topeka, and Dorothy handled it with the same methodical thoroughness she had applied to every other problem, corresponding with her father's contact in the territorial government, hiring a local lawyer recommended by the land office, and assembling documentation of her claim so complete and well organized that the counterclaim was dismissed in June of 1879, with a formal note from the court that the original homestead claim was properly established and further challenges would be considered harassment. Haas did not bother them again. There was talk in Millhaven that he had gotten himself into financial difficulties with a bad cattle year and had sold off his eastern range to a new cattle company out of Topeka, and the new company had no interest in feuding with homesteaders and fenced their range properly and were, by all accounts, civil neighbors. Dorothy was sitting on the porch when Patrick brought her the news from town, reading the dismissal letter aloud, and she listened to the whole thing with her hands folded in her lap, and then she said, "Good," and that was all. But that evening after supper she walked out into the kitchen garden, which was full and green with the late spring, and she stood in it for a while in the way she sometimes stood in the middle of the land, just feeling the solidity of it, and Patrick came and stood beside her, and they did not talk for a long time, just stood in the warm evening air with the garden around them and the house behind them and the creek moving quietly in the distance. "We're going to be all right," she said finally. "Yes," he said. "We are." He slipped his arm around her and she leaned against him, and the prairie stretched out to the horizon in every direction, and the sky above it was the enormous fading blue of a long June evening, and there was nothing threatening about any of it. That summer they planted their first real crop, a practical combination of corn and wheat and a large kitchen garden, and Patrick hired 2 hands for the heavy work of the harvest season, young men from the settlement named Thomas and Roy who were hardworking and honest and called Dorothy ma'am with genuine respect and called Patrick boss, with an ease that still surprised him sometimes, not unpleasantly. The harvest that first year was not spectacular, but it was solid, enough to pay the hands and cover the winter supplies and the seed for next spring, and put a small amount aside that Dorothy recorded carefully in the account book she kept with the same precision she brought to everything. Patrick sold 2 horses he had bought and trained over the spring at a profit that was better than he had expected, and he told Dorothy about this new direction his thinking had been going, that horse breeding and training might be a serious livelihood on their claim, that the land could support a small herd of quality horses alongside the crops. Dorothy listened to him explain it at the kitchen table, spreading out his rough calculations and his notes, and when he finished she studied his numbers for a long moment and said, "This depends on the initial acquisition cost of good breeding stock, which is the main risk." "Yes," he said, "and you have identified the right stock. There's a man in Colorado Springs with a line of quarter horses that are exactly what I'd want to start with. I've been corresponding with him." "You've been corresponding with him," she said, looking up. "Since February," he said. She looked at him for a moment and then said, "Patrick, when did you start keeping things like this to yourself?" "I thought we were building this together." He blinked because it was a fair point and a gentle rebuke at the same time. "I didn't want to raise it until I knew it was feasible," he said. "I didn't want to add worry before it was real." "I appreciate that," she said. "And in the future tell me when you have an idea, feasible or not. I might have thoughts." "You always have thoughts," he said and smiled. "Yes," she agreed, and she smiled back, the real full one, and reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Right back to your man in Colorado Springs, but run the numbers by me first." He ran the numbers by her, and she found a way to trim the acquisition cost by negotiating a different payment arrangement. And in the spring of 1880, the first 4 quarter horses arrived on the Collier claim and were pastured in the new paddock that Patrick and Thomas and Roy built along the south fence line. The months had a rhythm now that Patrick had never had in his life before, and the rhythm was not dull but alive, each season bringing its specific work and its specific satisfactions. And through all of it the bedrock was Dorothy, her steadiness and her brightness, and her particular way of making every task feel like it was part of something larger and worth doing properly. He was a better man around her, not because she demanded it but because she expected it naturally, and he found he wanted to meet that expectation every day. They had been married a little over a year when Dorothy told him, on a cold February morning of 1880, standing in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, that they were going to have a child. Patrick put down the wood he was carrying and stood very still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and took the cup from her hands and set it down and took both her hands and held them. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm well," she said. "I've been to see the doctor in Millhaven. He says spring, late April or early May." She was looking at him with those clear green eyes, and there was wonder in them, real undefended wonder. "I'm not frightened," she said, and then added with complete honesty, "I'm a little frightened." "Me too," he said. "That's reassuring oddly," she said. He laughed and she laughed there in the kitchen of their house, and he pulled her close and held her, and outside the February sky was gray and the prairie was brown and cold, and it was absolutely the most beautiful morning of his life. Their son was born on the 1st of May, 1880, which Dorothy privately noted was exactly 18 months after she had filed her homestead claim, and the timing seemed to her like the land was keeping count of things. Patrick was present for the birth, as Dorothy had absolutely insisted upon, though the doctor from Millhaven and Mrs. Hale, who had come to help, both thought it irregular. Dorothy told them both that she was not a woman who did things according to what other people thought was regular, and that she wanted her husband in the room, and that was the end of it. They named the boy James Edward Collier, James for Patrick's father who had died when Patrick was 16, and Edward for Dorothy's father whose dream she was living on this piece of Kansas ground. The name had both of those weights in it and carried them lightly. James was a healthy, loud, brown-eyed baby who regarded the world from his first day with the attentive expression of someone trying to figure out how everything worked, which Dorothy said was clearly inherited from his father and Patrick said was clearly from his mother, and they both thought they were right. Mrs. Hale came every week that first year, bringing food and practical wisdom, and a fierce tenderness for the baby that she expressed by holding him very comfortably, and telling him useful things about the world in a low, conversational voice. And she never once got sentimental about it within anyone else's view, which fooled nobody at all. Will and Sarah Hendricks became a regular presence, and Sarah was expecting her own first child by the summer of 1880, which delighted Dorothy and made the two women closer still, sharing the knowledge and the worry and the occasional flat absurdity of new motherhood in the most honest terms, without the softening that polite society elsewhere required. The horse breeding enterprise grew steadily. Patrick sold his first trained quarter horses in the fall of 1880 at a price that justified every calculation, and he bought 2 more mares in the spring of 1881. And by the end of that year, it was clear that the horses were going to be the primary income of the Collier claim, supplemented by the wheat crop that Dorothy managed with increasing expertise. And they were not rich, but they were solidly, genuinely, debt-free solvent, which in 1881 Kansas was a thing worth celebrating. Dorothy marked the 5th year of her homestead claim, which fell in September of 1883, with a solemnity that Patrick understood entirely. 5 years of continuous improvement and residence, which was the requirement of the Homestead Act, meant that she could now file for the patent, the actual title deed, the proof that the land was hers in perpetuity. She rode to Dodge City with Patrick and James, who was 3 years old and very interested in Dodge City in the loud and comprehensive way of 3-year-olds with strong opinions, and she filed the final paperwork at the land office and paid the small patent fee, and the clerk stamped her application, and she walked out into the Dodge City street with the receipt in her hand, and she stopped on the wooden boardwalk and looked at it for a long moment. 6 years ago, she said, I was in Nashville reading about this in a pamphlet and my father told me it was impossible. And now, Patrick said, holding James on his hip, now I have a receipt, she said, and she smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had years in it. The patent deed arrived by mail in November of 1883, and Dorothy unfolded it and read every word and then folded it again and placed it in the locked document box that lived under the floorboard in the bedroom, alongside the marriage certificate and James's birth record and the original homestead filing, and she closed the box and locked it and stood up. It's done, she said. Patrick watched her from the doorway. How does it feel? She thought about it genuinely. Like putting your foot on solid ground after a very long crossing, she said. Like there was a moment when you weren't sure the shore was really there, and then it is, and it's exactly what you hoped. He crossed the room and kissed her forehead, and she leaned against him for a moment before straightening. James is eating dirt in the kitchen garden again, she said. He does that, Patrick said. He gets that from you. How do I eat dirt? I have never eaten dirt. Not literally. The stubbornness, the insistence on investigating everything personally. That is absolutely from you, Patrick said. They had this kind of argument often, and it never went anywhere, and both of them loved it. James grew up on the land with the specific confidence of a child whose parents are happy together, and who has room to run in every direction. He had Patrick's directness and Dorothy's precision, and by the time he was 5, he was following Patrick around the paddocks with the intense focus of someone learning a craft, and Dorothy had begun teaching him to read and do sums in the kitchen in the afternoons, and he took to both with equal intensity, which she said was exactly right. In 1884, when James was 4, Dorothy had a second pregnancy that ended early and quietly, and it was a grief that both of them held together without collapsing under it, because they had learned by then how to hold hard things without pretending they were light. Patrick found her one morning sitting at the kitchen table before he was up, very still in the gray early light, and he made coffee and sat across from her, and they did not say anything for a long time, and then she said, I keep thinking about what the Hendricks said when they lost theirs, that you carry them with you, the ones you don't get to keep. That's true, he said. It doesn't make it not hurt, she said. No, he said. She reached across the table, and he took her hand, and they sat like that in the quiet kitchen until James came padding in from his room in his nightshirt wanting breakfast, and the world required attending to again, and they attended to it, because that was also how you carried things. Their daughter arrived in 1885, a girl they named Clara May, and she was born with Dorothy's green eyes and a forceful personality that made itself known approximately 3 days after her birth and never let up. James was 5 and took his role as older brother with a seriousness that made everyone around him regularly try not to laugh, patting Clara on the head with a solemn responsibility that Clara immediately responded to by grabbing his finger and refusing to let go. She has your grip, Patrick told Dorothy. She has your stubbornness, Dorothy said. We have established this is yours, Patrick said. We have established no such thing, Dorothy said, but she was smiling down at Clara, who had by then released James's finger and was regarding the ceiling with that attentive look that was, indisputably, from both of them. Mrs. Hale died in the spring of 1886, peacefully in her own bed in her cabin 3 miles north, and it was Dorothy who found her and Dorothy who sat with her for a while before going to tell anyone. And when she came home, her eyes were red, and she sat at the kitchen table, and Patrick made her coffee and held her hand, and she said, She was the first person here who made me feel like I was going to be all right. She was something, Patrick said. She was entirely herself every moment, Dorothy said. That's what I want written on my own stone someday. She was entirely herself. You already are, Patrick said. Dorothy looked at him. Not entirely, she said. I'm more myself than I was in Nashville. I'm more myself than I was the day you found my map. But every year I'm a little more of what I think I actually am. She paused. That's what this land does, I think. It strips off the things that aren't real. He thought about this and found it was precisely accurate and told her so. They gave Mrs. Hale a proper burial in the Millhaven church graveyard, and half the county came, because she had been there longer than most and had helped more people than she ever mentioned. And the preacher said she was a woman who had built community with her hands and her kitchen and her plain speaking, and that was exactly right. The Collier claim had been something to build in 1878 and something to protect in 1879 and something to grow in the years after. And by 1887, it was something to admire. The house had been extended twice, a second bedroom added when Clara arrived, and a larger kitchen added the year after because Dorothy's kitchen had become the gathering place for a significant number of people on a regular basis. And the original four-room house simply was not large enough for what life had grown into. The horse operation had 12 breeding animals and a good reputation from Kansas to Colorado, and Patrick had trained 2 young men from the settlement, Thomas's younger brother Eddie, and a sharp-eyed boy named Marcus who had arrived in Millhaven on his own at 17, and applied for work with such direct confidence that Patrick had hired him on the spot. And they managed the horses with a competence that let Patrick expand his attention to the broader management of the claim. James, at 7, could ride every horse on the property and had opinions about which ones were the best that he was not shy about sharing. Clara, at 2, had opinions about everything and was not shy about any of them. Dorothy planted trees that year, a row of cottonwoods along the south fence and apple trees near the kitchen garden, which was by now extensive and productive enough to supply the Hendricks and 2 other neighboring families with surplus preserves through the winter. She said that trees were the thing she had missed in the early years, that a place without trees felt exposed, and Patrick pointed out that she had not seemed to feel exposed in the early years, and she said that was different. She had been focused on other things. Will and Sarah Hendricks had 4 children by 1887, and the 2 families had settled into the particular easy friendship of people who have been through things together and have not found each other wanting. Will had taken up blacksmithing as a secondary trade and was the best within 20 miles, and there was a running friendly argument between him and Patrick about whether horses or iron were the better business that had been going on for 6 years and showed no sign of resolving. The prairie stretched on. The seasons turned, one into the next, with the hard, specific honesty the West had about seasons, and the Collier claim moved through them and was changed by them, and changed them in its own small way, because a piece of ground that is properly loved becomes a different thing than it was before. One evening in the autumn of 1887, Patrick sat on the front porch of the house watching the sun go down over the prairie in the long red and gold of an October sunset, the kind that stained the whole sky. Dorothy came out and sat beside him, close, their shoulders touching, and she had her coffee and he had his, and the prairie in front of them was enormous and beautiful and theirs. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About how different this is from what I planned," she said. "I planned for the land and the house and the proving up and the pat. I planned very carefully and very practically, and everything I planned came to pass." "It did," he said. "But I didn't plan for you," she said. "You weren't in any of my calculations. You came from entirely outside the plan." "Via a gust of wind and a piece of paper," he said. "Via a gust of wind and a piece of paper," she agreed. She looked at him with those green eyes, deep in the late light, and she said, "I think that's the thing I know now that I didn't know then. You can plan for everything you can see, but the thing that changes everything comes from a direction you weren't watching." "I was watching the direction," he said. "I turned around and rode toward it." She smiled, the full, real smile. "You did," she said. That was the important part. He took her hand where it lay between them on the bench and held it, the way he had been holding it for 9 years, and the sun continued its descent toward the flat line of the prairie, and the sky above it turned from gold to rose to the deep and tender blue of the coming night. And somewhere behind them in the house James was making the particular kind of noise that meant he and Clara were involved in a negotiation that was about to require parental intervention. And the horses moved quietly in the paddock, and the cottonwood trees along the south fence rustled in the cooling air. "Patrick," Dorothy said, he said, "I'm glad you turned around." He turned to look at her, and she was looking back at him. And 9 years of this land and this life and this building were between them, and also behind them, and also all around them. And he said, "I would turn around 1,000 times." And she held his hand tighter and leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat there in the last of the evening light as the first stars came out over Kansas. The years continued to be generous in the way that hard-earned things are generous, not effortlessly but sustainably, with the depth that comes from knowing the cost. James grew into a serious, capable boy who had his mother's mind for detail and his father's ease with horses. And by the time he was 12, he was running the morning feeding and training schedule with a confidence that made the older hands treat him as an equal, which he accepted with a seriousness that made Patrick simultaneously proud and amused. Clara grew into a bright and forceful girl who learned to read at 4 and had read everything in the house by 8, and informed her parents with complete certainty that she intended to attend a proper school, and then come back to the claim and run it better than any of them. And Dorothy looked at her daughter making this announcement with the specific expression of a woman who recognizes herself. There was another child, a second boy they named Henry, born in the summer of 1889 when James was 9 and Clara was 4. Henry came into the world at full volume and didn't particularly quiet down for the first several years, and was loved comprehensively for every loud moment of it. The claim by 1890 looked nothing like the empty stretch of prairie where Dorothy had been standing with her hands pressed to the earth 12 years before, and also looked exactly like it, because the bones of it were the same, the creek still bending south before it straightened, the slight rise where the house stood, the dark good soil that Dorothy had noted in her margin notes on the day the map had blown away from her and changed her life. The house was large and white with blue trim, the trim always freshened in the spring, because Dorothy had decided the blue was an important feature, and it remained so. The orchard was old enough to bear properly now, and in August the smell of the apple trees came through the windows and filled the house with something that felt, to everyone in it, like home distilled. Patrick was 40 years old in 1890 and Dorothy was 36, and they had been building this life for 12 years, and it fit them like something made to measure, which it was, because they had measured it together every step. There was a morning in early spring of 1891 when Patrick rode the perimeter of the claim, something he did seasonally, checking the fences and the drainage and the general condition of the land the way you check on something you care about. He was on a fine bay horse named Coda, one of the claim's own breeding, and the prairie around the Collier land was just beginning to green at the roots, that first faint green of early spring that was more promise than reality, and the sky was that particular pale blue that comes after a long winter, washed clean and enormous. He rode to the southeast corner of the claim, which was the corner nearest the creek bend, and he stopped there and looked back at the house on its rise, white against the sky, the smoke from the morning fire coming straight up in the still air. He could see Dorothy moving in the kitchen garden, already at work, her blue dress bright against the brown earth, and he could see James in the paddock with one of the yearlings, and Clara on the porch doing her lessons with a book open on her knees, and Henry, probably, somewhere getting into something. He sat on Coda and looked at all of it for a long time. He thought about the man he had been in September of 1878, riding west with nothing pointing him anywhere in particular, and how a piece of paper had come at him out of the wind, and he had turned around. It was such a small thing, turning around, such a simple decision to carry the map back to whoever had lost it instead of tossing it aside and continuing on his way. He had spent 12 years thinking about that moment sometimes, not obsessively, but the way you think about the hinge points of your life, the places where the path branched, and you took one direction instead of another without fully understanding what you were choosing. He had turned around on the prairie because it seemed like the right thing to do, because someone had put careful work into that map and it mattered to them, and he had followed the wind's logic back to where Dorothy was standing, and she had taken the map from his hand with both of hers, and she had been so careful and so certain and so quietly, completely herself, that something in him had simply stopped moving. A compass finding north, he had told her. He still believed that was the right description. He turned Coda back toward the house and rode at an easy canter across the new spring grass, and Dorothy looked up from the kitchen garden when she heard the hooves and shaded her eyes with her hand and watched him come, the way she had been watching him come home for 12 years, and she was smiling before he was close enough for him to see it, because she always was. He pulled up at the garden fence and she came to it and looked up at him with those green eyes, creek water in the morning light, and he said, "Good morning," because some things were simple and didn't need to be complicated. "Good morning," she said. "Henry got into the flour bin." "How bad?" "Remarkable," she said. "Really a committed effort. I have him cleaning it up, which is more educational than punitive at this point." Patrick dismounted and tied Coda to the fence post and leaned on the top rail and looked at her. She had soil on her hands and a strand of hair loose from her pin, and she looked absolutely, entirely herself, the way she had been looking every morning for 12 years, and he thought, as he thought most mornings, that he was the luckiest man in Kansas. "What are you thinking?" she said, because she could always tell when he was thinking something. "I'm thinking about that map," he said. She tilted her head, not needing him to specify which map. There was only one map that mattered in the long story of them. "What about it?" "I'm thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't turned around," he said. "If I'd just crumpled it up and kept riding." Dorothy was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the direct, clear eyes that had always seen him straight. "Then I would have gone back to the creek and found the survey markers without it," she said. "I had the original survey description memorized. The map was important, but it wasn't essential." "So you would have been fine," he said. "I would have been fine," she confirmed. "I was going to be fine regardless." She paused, "but I would not have had you." "And that," she said simply and completely, "is the thing I cannot imagine now." He reached across the fence and took her hand, the one with the soil on it, and held it. "Neither can I," he said. They stood like that in the spring morning, with the orchard starting to bud behind her, and the horses moving in the paddock, and the smell of the prairie waking up all around them, and James's voice somewhere calling something to Marcus about the yearling's gait, and Clara's voice answering something from the porch that she clearly was not supposed to have heard, and Henry emerging from the kitchen door with a flour-dusted face, wearing an expression of extreme dignity, and the smoke from the fire going straight up into the blue sky, and the creek bending south before it straightened, just as it always had, and 160 acres of dark loam soil that was theirs, legally and entirely, documented and protected and loved into something real, all of it beginning with a gust of wind and a piece of paper and a man who turned around. Dorothy squeezed his hand and said, "Come inside when you're done with Coda. I've got bread in the oven." "5 minutes," he said. She let go of his hand and went back to her garden, and Patrick untied Coda and led him to the barn, taking the long way around by the paddock fence so he could see the whole claim in the morning light, every inch of it, and he looked at it with the full attention it deserved. In the evening, when the bread had been eaten and the dinner cleared and Henry had been bathed of the last of the flour and put to bed, and Clara had finished her lessons and James had completed his final check of the horses, and the house was quiet in the way it got at the end of a full day, Patrick and Dorothy sat on the front porch in the dark, the way they had been sitting on that porch for 12 years. The sky over Kansas was enormous and brilliant with stars, the way the sky gets when there is no town close enough to dim it, and the prairie was a dark and breathing presence all around them, and the cottonwood trees along the south fence moved softly in the night breeze. "James told me today that he wants to expand the horse operation when he's older," Dorothy said. "He has ideas." "I know," Patrick said. "He told me last week. He has good ideas." "He does," Dorothy said. "He also has Clara's ideas to contend with, since she has informed him that she will be involved in any decision of significance." "That's going to be interesting," Patrick said. "It's going to be spectacular," Dorothy said. They sat in the comfortable quiet that had no need to be filled, the specific quiet of two people who know each other well enough to be silent together without any awkwardness, who have spent enough years in the same space to have grown into each other's silences comfortably. The creek moved in the dark, the same creek that Dorothy had been standing beside on the 3rd of September, 1878, reading the land she had claimed and looking for the map that had blown away from her. And the land was the same land, patient and dark and endlessly itself, carrying everything that had happened on it with the indifference of geology and the specificity of memory. 13 years, Patrick thought. 13 years since the wind brought him a map and he turned around. He reached for Dorothy's hand in the dark and found it reaching for his, and they sat together under the vast Kansas sky, and the stars burned on, and the night was warm and full of the good smell of spring grass and apple blossom, and somewhere in the house their children were sleeping. 13 years, he said aloud. 13 years, she agreed, and her voice had everything in it, everything that the years had been and made and built. "And all of them worth it, every single one," he said. She leaned into him, and he put his arm around her, and they stayed like that until the night grew deep and the stars wheeled overhead the way they had been doing long before any of them arrived and would continue to do long after. And the prairie held them up, solid and real, exactly as it always had. Inside the house, the document box lay under the floorboard with its locked certainties, the homestead filing and the patent deed and the marriage certificate and the birth records of 3 children. And all of that paper was just the record of what was already true in a way that required no documentation at all. They were home. They had been home for a long time. The wind off the Kansas prairie could bring a man a map. It turned out, and a map could lead a man to a woman, and a woman could build a world out of 160 acres and a plan and a refusal to stop. And a man could choose at the right moment to turn around, and everything after could be the most real and solid thing he had ever known. That was all. That was everything. The stars turned. The prairie breathed. The creek bent south before it straightened, just as it always did, just as it would long after all of them were gone, patient and clear, and moving always in the direction it was meant to go. Inside the house, Dorothy Collier's map, the original hand-drawn map with the careful ink notations and the margin notes and the small sketches of a house and a barn and a kitchen garden, was folded and kept in the document box alongside the patent deed, not because it was necessary anymore, but because some things you keep not for their use but for what they mean. A map of a life, drawn before it was lived, pointing the way home.